Are newsstand comic books worth the premium? Well, in this video, I'm going to give you my 12 cents. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another video with Swaggle Haas. And in this video, we're going to talk about if newsstands are worth the premium in the marketplace. Obviously, this is sort of a hot button issue. A lot of people talking about newsstands commanding a huge markup compared to their direct edition counterparts. So we're going to get into it today and see if we can make sense of this crazy market for newsstands. But before I get into the topic, if you guys could drop me a like or a comment or subscribe if you're enjoying the content, help support the channel, do one of those things, and I would appreciate it. All right, that said, let us get into this here today. And, this is just going to be a little bit more podcasty of a video, a little more soapboxy. I'm just going to kind of give you guys my thoughts. And, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts as well in the comments. So let me know what you guys think. So I guess I want to start by asking ourselves the title of this video. Are newsstand comic books worth the premium that people are charging for them? Well, the answer is yes. Yes, they are. I mean, kind of, but yes, ultimately, because here's the reality. If people want to pay premiums for a newsstand comic books because they believe that that newsstand comic book is worth that price, then it's absolutely worth that price. I made videos in the past where I talked about value is based in belief, and the belief in the market for comic books is that newsstands have that value. So the question I think that we should ultimately be asking ourselves is, why do comic book collectors feel like newsstands are more valuable, and should they feel like newsstands are more valuable? Well, to answer those questions, I have to do a little bit of a history lesson for newsstand comic books. But before I continue to get into this, I want to pose a question to you guys that I'll revisit later on in the video, and that is, are things that are rare more valuable? Back in the day, pre-1980s, comic books used to be mostly sold on newsstands and spinner racks in supermarkets, grocery stores, 7-Elevens, wherever. That was just the old way that comic books were distributed in that time. And all of those comic books, typically speaking, used to have a barcode on them. And one of the interesting things about newsstands was that those comic books that didn't sell were actually sent back to distributors. Now we flash forward to the 1980s and the explosion of the comic book shops. Well, comic book shops would actually have this new version created just for them, and these would be called the direct edition comic books. Won't go too much on a tangent there, but there was a reason that the Marvel Publishing had to do this in order to make a distinction between what was going to be sold in comic book stores and what was going to be sold on newsstands because of the whole return policy thing. So if you are a comic book pre-1982 or so, you might see one that has a barcode on it compared to one that has a barcode with a slashed line through it. Now the slashed line through it, those would be the direct editions. These would be the comic books that were sold in comic book stores. Now, flash forward into the mid-80s, eventually Marvel would change those things and turn them into logos. So you might see a Spider-Man logo, or you might see, a 50-year anniversary logo. And those would be also known as the direct editions compared to the ones that we typically see as newsstand barcode comic books. Eventually in the mid-80s, there would be so many comic books and so many direct market comic books being made that the newsstand comic books really started to taper off overall. So this is actually a very interesting tangent as well, is that actually newsstands that come pre-1986 actually aren't as rare as people claim they are in this current market book. People still think that any newsstand comic book is valuable, but that's not actually the case. Although there is a lot of discussion that even if there were more newsstand comic books printed in pre-1985, the behavior of the people who bought those comic books, off the spinner racks, off the shelves, didn't really take care of them. So the ones that are in high grade, typically speaking, are still more rare, even though they were 90% of the marketplace. Then as we got into the 90s and the 2000s, newsstands would be less and less and less, and most comic books would be direct market comic books selling from comic book stores. And then in 2013, that would be the last time that Marvel would print newsstand comic books, and we'd have this closed window between the late 70s to the 2013 where there's a batch of newsstand comic books that exist. And now we have to enter the secondary market. This is the collector's market. Now for a long time, people actually didn't care between owning newsstands and direct edition comic books. Nobody really thought about it. Nobody in the collecting market knew the difference. Nobody really cared. There was no premium distinction between the two. And it was only until 2013, when the newsstand stopped being made, that Chuck Rosinski, legendary comic book seller from Mile High Comic Books, published a blog that went out into the market where he explained that a few of his buyers had actually been asking for newsstand copies. There were some people in the market that were seeking these specific types of comic books, to the point where he started to notice that, hey, there's a little bit of a demand for this. I can actually charge a little bit of a premium for this overall. And then he would go on to publish this big article explaining newsstand versus direct edition comic books, and he would explain that these are this much more scarce, therefore they are this much more valuable. And that slowly started to permeate into the culture of comic book collecting, to the point where now here in 2021, everybody knows about newsstands being more rare overall, and the market feels like these comic books are more valuable. But to me, this is honestly where it gets really interesting, because people now feel like the newsstand comic books are more valuable simply because the narrative is that these comic books are more valuable. Again, value is based in belief. But the reality is, even though anecdotally we feel like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Newsstands were more rare. They were handled, more poorly. Oh, I can look at the CGC, population, and yeah, typically speaking, it's harder to find newsstands. But the reality is, there is no data on this at all. Nobody has kept track of this. Okay, CGC doesn't label their newsstand comic books in the period being like, the 70s through around like the 90s or so. They've started to do it now, like later on in the, the 2000s era, with the variants being, the $3.99 newsstand versus the $2.99 direct edition. That's a whole other thing. But the reality is, nobody has the numbers on this thing. We just see it as a marketplace that we think that newsstands are more rare. Certainly there's a history to explain why they're more rare, but we don't actually know what the pop counts are. In fact, I'm not saying that this is an actual possibility or that this might be true or whatever, but when these newsstand editions would be sent back to the publishers, nobody really knows what they did with them. I mean, they could have just destroyed all the books and recycled all the paper. Publishers do that stuff, but who's to say that there's not somebody out there that went in and bought all the bulk newsstands, and somewhere out there's a giant warehouse filled with newsstand returned comic books. I mean, we don't really know. I mean, I'm not trying to imply conspiracies, but who knows? Mile High has so many comic books in their warehouse that they just, sit on in the back. Who's to say that Marvel didn't just say, hey, take all our newsstand copies, we're not going to use them. So this is something that's really interesting, is that we don't actually know what the value of these newsstand comic books are, simply because we don't actually know what the difference of the supply is overall. We're just going off of what is anecdotally and maybe empirically true. So now let's revisit the question. Are newsstands worth the premium that they're being charged for? Well, here's the thing. We are all victims to the meta of the market. This is the reality. This is the reality of all markets. This is the reality of all things, that this is just human nature, okay? For you gamers out there, let me give you an example. Let's say you're playing a video game and you know that a certain weapon is the most powerful weapon in the game. And everyone is starting to use that weapon because this is like the meta that is being formed around that. Everybody's using this weapon. And you might think, as like the person who is not using this weapon, you're like, oh, that's stupid. I don't want to use that. I'm not going to use that. But eventually, no matter what you do, even if you decide to ignore the fact that this thing exists, the entire environment, the entire culture is going to evolve around that meta of that weapon. So in the case of comic books, it doesn't matter if you are someone who doesn't like newsstands or doesn't care about them. The reality is, even if you ignore it, you're going to be bombarded by newsstands within the market. That's just the way that it goes. So if you're a seller, you have to start charging premiums on newsstand because everyone else is going to charge premiums on newsstand. If you're a collector and you want to collect certain books, and you want, say, a newsstand edition, you're going to have to pay the premium to get it. This is just the nature of the reality of us believing as a market that these books are more rare and therefore more valuable. But here's where it gets interesting to me. Again, that thing of, if it's more rare, is it more valuable? And this is where we have to start to talk about the Pence Variants, a big inconvenient truth in the comic book collecting market. Now, what are the Pence Variants? Maybe you guys have seen them before. These are typically the books, from the Silver Age and the Bronze Age that were made for the UK audience, sometimes also made for the Canadian audience as well. And you might recognize them being, having the Pence logo on it. Maybe it has like a different kind of weird number with a slash on it. And these are Silver Age comic books, ones that you are very, very well aware of. You've seen before, first appearances of Black Panther and Spider-Man, etc., etc. And these have Pence Variants on it. So now, where did these come from? Because a lot of people in the market talk about these things as being, oh, reprints. These are reprints that came out for the UK audience. But the reality is these are not reprints. In fact, you could almost make the argument that these are first prints. What do you mean, Swaggle What are you talking about? Well, in the 1960s, when they were doing print runs for these Silver Age comic books, they would make, of course, the US edition, but they also would print comic books for the UK markets. And guess what? Those comic books were printed in the US. And not only that, because the UK market obviously is a lot smaller than the US market, these comic books comprise of about 5% of all the prints for these comic books. And because they had to go overseas and be shipped overseas, guess what? They had to print these comic books first. They printed them in the USA first, then sent them to the UK so that distributors over there could sell them, and then they would go on to print the US based comic books here. So knowing what we know about newsstands being more rare, now we have to talk about these Pence variants. They were printed at the same time of the original first prints of these Silver Age and Bronze Age comic books, but they only comprise of 5% of the print run, and then they were also had to be shipped overseas. I mean, imagine, we're talking about, in newsstands, people talk about, newsstands, they were handled more poorly because people bought them off the racks and they didn't take care of them. I mean, imagine these Pence variants. They had to be shipped overseas in boats, in crates, brought to these, places in a different country, and then thrown out onto the shelf. So these ones also were handled much more poorly than their American counterparts. So what does that mean for the collecting market? Why do we not value the Pence variants, which are in fact more rare than their American counterparts? In fact, I do have something that I want to show you guys here. Let's just take for one example. I have a Journey into Mystery 85, first appearance of Loki. Of course, this is a hot book coming off the heels of Loki here, and I just want to kind of show you a snapshot of some of these prices. So let's just take a look here at the 3.0. Here you can see on GPA analysis, this is the 3.0 where I'm hovering my line. This is going to be the US edition, and then here you see right here 3.0 UK price variant. So what did the UK price variant sell for in this current market? We can see a sale in 2021, $19.95 for a 3.0 UK price variant. And what does the 3.0 US version sell for? Well, we can see here a high in 2021, $3,600. So we're comparing $19.95 to $3,600. That means that you could actually get a UK Pence version of the same comic book for, about 40% less of the value. In fact, with these Pence comic books, I often see people charging way, way, way less than their US counterparts. Well, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, if we're talking about newsstand versus direct editions, newsstands are commanding a premium twice the value, 3 times the value, 4 times the value. So then why aren't these Pence variants commanding a premium? Well, I don't believe that the market knows about them as well. And I don't believe that the narrative within the market is that these are more rare and therefore more valuable. So value is based in belief, and if people don't believe that these comic books are more valuable, then they're not going to be charged a premium. So now what does this mean? I mean, if we have these Pence variants and we're talking about newsstands commanding a premium, well, to me, it seems like there's only one of two ways that this goes. Either eventually people start to say, rare things, rare variants, who really cares? We don't need newsstands. Or the market starts to realize the Pence things are more rare. They're 5%, of the actual printed run. Who knows what the correction of that numbers are after they've been mishandled or whatever. Maybe they're 1 to 2%. And eventually the market realizes that these are the more rare variants, and therefore we should charge a premium on that. And here's the reality. I think it's inevitable. I actually really believe this. I mean, I think that eventually, as people start to learn about, Pence variants, they're going to start to ask those questions. They're going to see the Pence on the comic book, just like they saw the newsstands on the comic book. And they're going to ask the question, hey, why does it have this thing? Or, hey, why does it have this different number on it? And once people start to ask those questions, they're going to start to research. They're going to start to learn more about it. And then eventually it's going to come out that these comic books were printed at the same time in the USA. The only difference is the number on it, and therefore they're going to be more rare variants. Now, the only way I see that not taking over in the market is that people in the US are just very, very stubborn, and we say this is America and we don't like our weird Pence variant numbers. But hey, let's be honest, we're not talking about aesthetics here. I think the newsstand comic books look stupid with their barcodes. I mean, I'd much rather have a logo of Spider-Man on it. So I don't think people care too much about aesthetics. Or the other possibility of why this never takes over is that there are people who have money in the market, big time collectors who will not want to know that what they paid for their comic book is not actually the top one in the market. We all know that, there's people who have paid extreme amounts of money, millions of dollars for, Amazing Spider-Man or Amazing Fantasy 15. But, those people think that when they're buying those comic books, they're getting the best version, the most valuable version of that comic book. And if we come to find out that the Pence version of Amazing Fantasy 15 actually should be worth more than the American counterpart, I feel like those people with big money are not going to be happy about it. So in conclusion, are newsstand comic books worth the premium that people are paying for them? Well, the answer is yes, because people are willing to pay for them. But at the end of the day, collect what you like. I mean, don't get swayed to the newsstand thing if you don't actually care. If it's just for your own personal collection, who really cares which one you have, the direct or newsstand edition? But the reality is, if you see two comic books, one being a newsstand and one being a direct edition, and they're the same price, I mean, everyone is going to be affected by the belief of the newsstand being more valuable, and everyone is going to choose the newsstand comic book. Anyways, that is all I have for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Hopefully you guys thought that was interesting and could follow the discussion here. Let me know what you guys think. Drop me a like, comment, subscribe. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and especially on the Pence variant ones. I think Pence variants are going to eventually take over in the marketplace. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.